The first bullet shattered the morning silence at 5:47 hours, and by 5:48, 12 Navy SEALs were pinned down in what would become the longest siege in modern special operations history. What nobody knew, not the Pentagon brass watching satellite feeds, not the Joint Chiefs huddled in crisis meetings, not even the SEALs themselves bleeding into Afghan soil, was that salvation would come from the sky in a form so unexpected, so quietly lethal, that enemy fighters would later whisper her name in the same breath as death itself. The mountain compound outside Gardes had been under surveillance for 3 months. Intelligence suggested it housed a high-value target, a bomb maker whose signature devices had killed 43 American servicemen across 2 provinces. The mission brief was surgical: fast insertion, target acquisition, extraction before dawn. Clean, simple, routine. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reaper Kowalski led Alpha Team through the pre-dawn darkness, their boots silent on frozen ground. Behind him, 11 of America's finest warriors moved like shadows, each man a symphony of lethal precision. The compound sat nestled in a natural bowl, surrounded by jagged peaks that clawed at the star-drunk sky. Perfect for hiding, perfect for dying. "Overwatch, this is Alpha One," Kowalski whispered into his throat mic. "Approaching target building. Thermal shows multiple heat signatures, count 6, possibly 7 tangos inside." Above them, circling at 12,000 feet, Captain Vera Wraith Volkov adjusted her night vision scope and studied the compound through her aircraft's targeting system. The AC-130 Spectre gunship she piloted was invisible against the black canvas of night, its engines a whisper compared to the mountain wind. 4 years flying these missions, and she'd never lost a ground team. Not one. "Copy Alpha One. Wraith has eyes on target, all approaches covered." The explosion came without warning, not from inside the compound, but from the ridgelines surrounding it. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions that shouldn't have existed, from rocks and shadows that intelligence swore were empty. The SEALs had walked into a trap so perfect, so brutally orchestrated, that in the first 30 seconds of contact, 3 men were down and the rest were diving for cover behind a stone wall that offered protection from only 2 directions. "Contact, contact," Kowalski's voice cracked across the radio. "We're taking heavy fire from all sides. This is not 6 tangos, repeat, this is not 6 tangos. We've got 50-plus fighters in prepared positions." In her cockpit 12,000 feet above, Vera felt her blood turn to ice water. The compound had been bait. The real target was never the bomb maker. It was the SEALs themselves. The siege of Gardes had begun, and with it, a legend that would haunt mountains for generations. 57 minutes into the firefight, ammunition was running critical, and blood was pooling in the dirt behind the stone wall that had become both sanctuary and tomb. Kowalski pressed his back against the cold rocks, feeling the impact of bullets striking inches from his head. Concrete dust filled his mouth, mixing with the metallic taste of fear. "Alpha 2, what's your status?" he called to his second-in-command, Petty Officer Jake Mongoose Williams. "3 wounded, sir. Rodriguez took 1 in the shoulder, Peterson's got shrapnel in his leg, and Brooks—" Williams paused, looking at the medic who was frantically working on the youngest member of their team. "Brooks is unconscious, possible concussion from that RPG blast." The enemy had them in a perfect kill box. Fighters positioned on 3 ridgelines maintained overlapping fields of fire, turning any movement into a death sentence. Every time one of the SEALs tried to shift position, bullets sparked off stone and whined through the air like angry hornets. They were trapped, outgunned, and running out of time. "Wraith, we need immediate fire support on grid 314-67, Kowalski transmitted, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Danger close. Repeat, danger close." 12,000 feet above, Vera studied her targeting display with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. The enemy positions were clearly marked by muzzle flashes, but they were less than 50 meters from the pinned SEALs. One miscalculation, 1 degree off target, and she'd kill the very men she was trying to save. Negative on grid 314-267, she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos below. Too close to friendly positions. I need you to mark targets with IR strobes if possible. We can't move to mark targets, Williams shouted over the gunfire. They've got every angle covered. In the growing daylight, the enemy's advantage was becoming overwhelming. What had been hidden positions in darkness were now clearly visible defensive works, machine gun nests carved into rock faces, sniper hides that commanded perfect sight lines, and fighting positions that had obviously been prepared for weeks. The intelligence failure was complete, catastrophic. Vera circled her gunship in a tight orbit, her weapons systems officer, Technical Sergeant Mike Radar Chen, working frantically to identify targets that could be engaged without risking fratricide. I count at least 40 fighting positions, Chen reported. They're dug in deep, Captain. This wasn't some hasty ambush. They knew we were coming. Below, the SEALs were learning the same harsh truth. Kowalski studied the enemy positions through his scope, noting the professional spacing, the interlocking fields of fire, the way each position covered the others. These weren't Taliban farmers with AK-47s. These were experienced fighters who had turned a remote mountain compound into a fortress specifically designed to kill American Special Operations Forces. The first call for extraction came at 6:45 hours, exactly 58 minutes after first contact. But as Kowalski would learn, getting out was going to be far harder than getting in. Command, this is Alpha 1, Kowalski transmitted on the emergency frequency. We need immediate extraction. Heavy contact, multiple casualties, ammunition critical. Request QRF and medical support. The response from Forward Operating Base Chapman was swift but not encouraging. Alpha 1, Command copies your request. Be advised, weather is degrading in your area. Extraction birds are grounded until conditions improve. Estimate 30 minutes minimum before launch. 30 minutes. In a firefight, 30 minutes was an eternity. Kowalski looked at his men, good soldiers, the best America had to offer, and saw the same calculation in their eyes. They might not have 30 minutes. Wraith, what's your fuel status? He asked the circling gunship. Vera checked her instruments. 4 hours on station, Alpha 1. I'm not going anywhere. It was the first small comfort in an increasingly desperate situation. The AC-130 Spectre was a marvel of airborne firepower, a modified cargo plane bristling with cannons, machine guns, and sensors that could see through darkness itself. In the right hands, it was the difference between death and going home to family. Vera Volkov had the right hands. Born in a refugee camp outside Kiev, raised in Detroit's inner city, Vera had clawed her way into military aviation through sheer determination and skill that bordered on the supernatural. Her call sign, Wraith, came from an uncanny ability to appear exactly when ground forces needed her most, delivering precision fire support that seemed to defy physics. But today's challenge was beyond anything she'd faced. The enemy had chosen their ground perfectly. The compound sat in a natural amphitheater with steep ridges on 3 sides and a narrow valley mouth to the south. The ridgelines provided perfect observation and fields of fire, while the steep terrain made assault nearly impossible. Worse, the positions were hardened, carved into rock, reinforced with timber and sandbags, designed to withstand everything short of direct artillery strikes. Rodriguez is bleeding pretty bad, Brooks reported, his voice tight with pain as he regained consciousness. The team medic had a gash across his forehead and his left arm hung useless, but his eyes were clear and focused. Williams, get me the med kit. We need to get a tourniquet on Rodriguez's shoulder. The wounded were becoming a critical factor. In any firefight, casualties created a tactical dilemma. Do you risk more lives trying to save the wounded, or do you focus on the mission? For SEALs, there was never really a choice. They would die before leaving a teammate behind. But as the sun climbed higher and the enemy fire intensified, that noble principle was becoming a death sentence for them all. At 7:12 hours, the situation deteriorated further when enemy mortars began falling around the SEALs' position. The first round landed 20 meters to their left, showering them with rocks and dirt. The second was closer. The third round landed so close that the concussion lifted Williams completely off the ground and slammed him against the stone wall. "They're walking mortars onto our position," Peterson shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the constant crack of bullets overhead. "We need to move." But there was nowhere to go. Every direction led into interlocking fields of fire that would cut them down in seconds. They were pinned in place, unable to advance or retreat, while an increasingly accurate mortar barrage crept closer to their position. 12,000 feet above, Vera watched the mortar impacts through her targeting system and felt a cold fury building in her chest. She'd spent 4 years protecting ground forces, and she'd never lost a team. She wasn't about to start now. "Radar, I need a firing solution on those mortar positions," she commanded. "Working on it, Captain," Chen replied, his fingers flying over his instruments. "Got 2 probable locations on the eastern ridgeline, grid 315-69 and 316-71. Range to target 1,400 meters from friendly positions, close but workable." Vera's hands tightened on the controls. The 25mm cannon on her aircraft could accurately engage targets at ranges that seemed impossible, but with friendlies so close, there was no margin for error. One round off target could kill the men she was trying to save. "Alpha 1 Wraith, I have solutions on enemy mortar positions. Preparing to engage with 25mm, keep your heads down." The Spectre's cannon spoke with a voice like thunder, sending streams of high-explosive rounds into the enemy positions with surgical precision. Each round was guided by sensors that could track individual bullets in flight, making corrections that put explosive death exactly where it was needed. The enemy mortar fire ceased abruptly, as the gun positions were obliterated in clouds of smoke and flying rock. But even as one threat was eliminated, 2 more took its place. The enemy commander was professional, adapting his tactics in real time. If mortars couldn't reach the trapped Americans, there were other ways to kill them. The psychological pressure was as deadly as the bullets. Trapped behind inadequate cover, constantly under fire, watching their ammunition dwindle and their wounded suffer. It was a situation designed to break men's minds before it broke their bodies. But these weren't ordinary men. These were SEALs, forged in training so brutal that most candidates broke before earning the right to wear the trident. They would endure. But endurance had its limits, and those limits were approaching fast. By 800 hours, 3 hours into the siege, the tactical situation had crystallized into a deadly stalemate. The enemy held all the advantages: numbers, position, and time. The SEALs had superior training and the support of one of the most lethal aircraft in the American arsenal, but those advantages were being eroded with every passing minute. Kowalski's radio crackled with updates that ranged from bad to catastrophic. Weather at Chapman was worsening, grounding the quick reaction force indefinitely. Higher command was scrambling assets, but the nearest Apache gunships were 2 hours away. Artillery support was impossible due to the steep terrain and proximity of friendly forces. For all practical purposes, the 12 men were on their own. "Water's getting low," Williams reported during a brief lull in enemy fire. "Peterson and Martinez are sharing 1 bottle, and Rodriguez hasn't been able to drink anything since he took that hit." Dehydration was becoming a critical factor. In the high altitude and thin air of the Afghan mountains, the human body consumed water at an alarming rate. Add the stress of combat, the adrenaline, the physical exertion of staying alive under fire, and water became as precious as ammunition. "Ration what you have," Kowalski ordered, Make it last. Above them, Vera was fighting her own battle against time and fuel consumption. The Spectre's engines drank fuel at a steady rate, and while she had hours remaining on station, she was also the only thing standing between the SEALs and annihilation. If she had to leave for refueling, the ground team would be completely exposed. "Captain, I'm tracking movement on the southern ridgeline," Chen reported. "Looks like they're trying to flank the friendlies." Vera adjusted her sensors and immediately saw the threat. A squad of enemy fighters was moving through a ravine that would bring them to within 30 meters of the SEAL's position. Once they gained that ground, the stone wall that had been sanctuary would become a tomb. Alpha 1 Wraith, you've got enemy movement approaching your 6 o'clock, approximately 15 tangos using the southern ravine for concealment. They'll be on top of you in 5 minutes. Kowalski felt his stomach drop. They couldn't defend in 2 directions simultaneously, not with their ammunition running low and 3 men wounded. If the enemy gained that position, the mission would be over and 12 families would be planning funerals. "Can you engage them?" he asked, already knowing the answer would be complicated. "Negative on direct fire," Vera replied. "They're using the ravine for concealment and it's too close to your position for cannon fire, but I might have another option." What she had in mind was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only chance the SEALs had. The Spectre carried more than just cannons. In its belly were systems designed for psychological warfare, for breaking enemy morale and turning their own fears against them. "Alpha 1, I need you to trust me on this one." The AC-130 Spectre suddenly dove from its circling altitude, descending from 12,000 feet to just 500 feet above the mountain peaks in a maneuver that pushed both aircraft and crew to their limits. At that altitude, the gunship was vulnerable to small arms fire, but it was also close enough for its psychological warfare systems to be devastatingly effective. Vera activated the aircraft's sound system and flooded the mountain valleys with a sound that seemed to come from hell itself. The recorded roar of jet engines mixed with artillery explosions, played at volumes that could be heard for miles. The psychological effect was immediate and terrifying. To fighters who had never faced such technology, it sounded like the sky itself was falling. But the real genius of Vera's plan wasn't the sound. While the enemy fighters in the ravine were distracted and disoriented by the audio assault, she used the aircraft's infrared systems to track their exact positions and relay coordinates to Kowalski's team. "Alpha 1, mark these grids," she transmitted, sending precise location data to the SEAL's tactical displays. 15 tangos at the following coordinates. For the first time in hours, the SEALs had accurate intelligence on enemy positions that they could actually engage. Williams and 2 other snipers positioned themselves to cover the ravine approach, while the rest of the team maintained security on the other sectors. The enemy fighters emerged from the ravine exactly where Vera had predicted and walked directly into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. In 15 seconds of precisely aimed fire, the flanking attempt was shattered. Bodies fell among the rocks, and the survivors fled back into the mountains. But the victory came at a cost. The low-altitude maneuver had exposed the Spectre to ground fire, and Chen reported multiple impacts on the aircraft's fuselage. "How bad?" Vera asked, fighting to keep the aircraft stable as she climbed back to safer altitude. "Hydraulics are damaged, we're losing fuel from the starboard tank, and I think they hit one of our sensor arrays," Chen replied. "We can stay on station, but our capabilities are degraded." The aircraft that was the SEAL's lifeline was bleeding fuel and losing the systems that made precision fire support possible. Time, ammunition, water, and now air support were all running out simultaneously. The siege was entering its critical phase. At 9:30 hours, 4.5 hours into the longest firefight of their lives, the SEALs received news that changed everything. The Quick Reaction Force was finally airborne, but weather had forced them to take a route that would delay their arrival by another 2 hours. In the brutal mathematics of combat, 2 hours might as well have been forever. "We're not going to make it," Peterson said quietly, voicing what they were all thinking. The machine gunner had been fighting with shrapnel in his leg for hours, and pain was etched into every line of his face. "We're out of ammo, out of water, and that bird up there is shot to pieces." "Belay that talk," Kowalski snapped, but his words carried less conviction than usual. He'd done the calculations himself. At their current rate of ammunition expenditure, they had perhaps 30 minutes of effective fire left. The wounded were getting worse. Rodriguez had lost consciousness again, and Brooks was showing signs of severe concussion. Above them, Vera was facing her own impossible decision. The Spectre's fuel situation was becoming critical, and the damaged hydraulics were making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. By regulation, she should return to base immediately for emergency repairs. By every tactical manual ever written, staying on station with a damaged aircraft was reckless endangerment of crew and equipment. But 12 men were dying in the rocks below, and Vera Volkov had never abandoned a mission in her life. "Radar, what's our fuel status?" 40 minutes to critical, Captain. If we stay much longer, we won't make it back to base." Vera stared down at her targeting display, watching the heat signatures of the trapped SEALs. 12 blinking dots of light in a sea of hostile mountains. 12 men who had wives, children, parents who loved them. 12 men whose only hope of seeing home again was a damaged gunship piloted by a woman whose own father had never believed she was capable of anything beyond making coffee and bobbies. "We stay," she said quietly. "Captain." "We stay, Radar. Those are Americans down there." Chen looked at his pilot for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am, we stay." The decision to remain on station with a damaged aircraft in hostile territory violated every safety protocol in military aviation. It was the kind of choice that could end careers, that could result in court-martial if it went wrong. But it was also the kind of choice that separated legends from ordinary pilots. As if sensing the aircraft's commitment, the enemy began their final assault. The attack came from all sides simultaneously, a coordinated push designed to overwhelm the SEALs' remaining defensive capability. Machine gun fire raked their position from 3 directions, while RPGs exploded against the stone wall that had sheltered them for hours. Smoke filled the air, making it impossible to see more than a few meters in any direction. "Contact front, contact left, contact right." Multiple voices screamed over the radio as the enemy closed in from all directions. Kowalski tried to coordinate the defense, but chaos was taking over. Williams was engaging targets to the north while Peterson dragged Rodriguez to better cover. Brooks, still barely conscious, was mechanically loading magazines with shaking hands. The professional discipline that had held them together for hours was fracturing under the crushing weight of sustained combat. "We need fire support now," Kowalski yelled into his radio. "Danger close all sides, light up everything that moves." Above the chaos, Vera made a decision that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. With her sensors damaged and visibility obscured by smoke, conventional fire support was impossible. But the Spectre carried one weapon system that didn't require sensors or clear visibility: the 105 howitzer that formed its primary armament. The howitzer was designed for targets at least 1,000 meters from friendly forces. The SEALs were surrounded by enemies at less than 50 meters. Using the big gun in such circumstances was beyond dangerous. It was insane. Vera armed the 105 anyway. "Alpha 1 Wraith, I'm going to use the 105 to break up their assault. When I give the word, get everyone as low as possible and cover your ears. This is going to be close." The Spectre's 105 howitzer was a naval gun mounted in the side of an aircraft. a marriage of sea power and air power that created something entirely new in the history of warfare. When it fired, the muzzle blast was visible for miles, and the sound could shatter windows at 1,000 meters. Vieira lined up her first shot on a machine gun position that had been pouring fire into the SEALs for hours. The gun was less than 70 meters from friendly forces, well within the danger zone for friendly fire. But she had studied this weapon system for 4 years, had fired it in combat dozens of times, and she knew its capabilities better than the engineers who designed it. "Shot out," she transmitted. The 105 Michelle impacted exactly where she intended, obliterating the enemy position in a column of fire and smoke that rose hundreds of feet into the morning sky. The concussion wave knocked every SEAL flat and cracked the stone wall they had been sheltering behind, but none of them were seriously injured. The psychological effect on the enemy was immediate and devastating. Fighters who had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves facing firepower that seemed to come from the gods themselves. The coordinated assault wavered, then broke as fighters sought cover from the skyborne death that could find them anywhere. But using the 105 at close range had consequences. The repeated firing damaged the aircraft's already compromised hydraulics further, and Chen reported that they were now critically low on fuel. "Captain, we have to go," he said urgently. "If we don't leave now, we're not making it home." Vieira looked down at her targeting display one more time. The enemy assault had been broken, but they were still surrounding the SEALs. In 30 minutes, maybe less, they would regroup and attack again. The Americans had perhaps one more firefight left in them before their ammunition was completely exhausted. "Alpha 1 Wraith," she transmitted. "I'm going to have to leave you for fuel. I'll be back as fast as I can." The silence that followed was more terrifying than all the gunfire that had preceded it. When the sound of the Spectre's engines faded into the distance, the mountains fell into a silence that was somehow worse than the constant noise of battle. For nearly 5 hours, the AC-130 had been their guardian angel, their lifeline to the world beyond the killing ground. Now they were truly alone. "Equipment check," Kowalski ordered, trying to maintain the leadership that had held his team together through the longest night of their lives. "Ammunition, water, medical supplies. I want exact counts." The inventory was grim. Between the 12 men, they had fewer than 200 rounds of small arms ammunition remaining. Water was down to 3 bottles, barely enough for the wounded. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. They'd used most of their field dressings during the first hour of contact. "Sir," Williams said quietly, "maybe we should consider." "No," Kowalski's voice was flat, final. "We don't discuss that option, ever." Every special operations soldier knew the unspoken reality. There were times when surrender might be tactically sound, when saving lives took precedence over completing missions. But this wasn't one of those times. The enemy they faced wasn't interested in prisoners. The SEALs had seen enough aftermath photos, enough intelligence reports, to know what happened to Americans who fell into the wrong hands in these mountains. They would fight until they couldn't fight anymore, and then they would fight some more. "Rodriguez is unconscious again," Brooks reported. The medic had been holding together through sheer willpower, but his own injuries were taking their toll. "I think he's got internal bleeding. He needs a hospital, not a battlefield." The wounded were becoming a critical factor in the tactical equation. Every decision now had to account for men who couldn't move quickly, couldn't fight effectively, couldn't contribute to their own survival. In the cold calculus of warfare, they were becoming liabilities that endangered the entire team. But SEALs didn't abandon their wounded, no matter what the cost. It was a principle written in blood across decades of operations, a covenant that bound them together and made them more than just soldiers. They were brothers, and brothers didn't leave brothers behind. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the enemy began probing their defenses again. Single shots from different directions, trying to determine if the Americans were still combat effective, testing their response times, looking for weaknesses in their perimeter. "Movement at 2 o'clock," Martinez whispered, tracking a figure moving between rocks on the eastern ridgeline. "Single Tango, approximately 400 meters. "Conserve ammunition," Kowalski replied. "Don't engage unless you have a clear shot and it's worth the round." It was a conversation that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, when ammunition was plentiful and the mission was straightforward. Now every bullet had to count. Every engagement had to be weighed against the dwindling resources that stood between life and death. The sniper took his time, controlled his breathing, squeezed the trigger with the patience of a man who understood that missing wasn't an option. The distant figure dropped, and the mountains returned to their ominous silence. One enemy down, 49 left, maybe 50, and exactly 197 rounds remaining. At 11:47 hours, nearly 6 hours into the siege, salvation appeared on the horizon in the form of a distant black dot growing larger against the azure sky. The Spectre was returning, its engine straining with the effort of climbing back to combat altitude on damaged hydraulics and critically low fuel. "Alpha 1, Wraith is back on station," Vieira's voice crackled over the radio, and 12 American warriors felt hope return to their hearts. But the hope was tempered by reality. Chen's voice followed immediately. "Be advised, we have 15 minutes on station maximum. Fuel is critical, and we're flying on manual controls only." 15 minutes. After hours of siege, 15 minutes felt like both an eternity and no time at all. It would have to be enough. "Wraith, we've got movement all around our position," Kowalski reported. "They're setting up for another assault. We're down to our last magazines." Through her damaged sensors, Vieira could see the enemy forces repositioning for what was clearly intended as the final attack. They had learned from their earlier failures, adapting their tactics to account for the devastating fire support that had broken their previous assaults. This time, they would attack from positions that the Spectre couldn't engage without killing the Americans they were trying to protect. It was a perfect tactical solution to an impossible problem, and Vieira knew that conventional weapons wouldn't be enough to break it. That's when she remembered the lesson her father had taught her 20 years earlier, back when he still believed his daughter would never amount to anything. "Sometimes, little bird, the only way to win is to change the rules of the game." Vieira was about to change the rules in a way that would rewrite military doctrine and create a legend that would outlive them all. "Alpha 1, I need you to trust me one more time," she transmitted. "When I give the word, I want everyone to get inside that compound. I don't care if there are enemy fighters in there. Get inside and stay inside until I tell you otherwise." Kowalski stared at the compound that had been their target 6 hours and a lifetime ago. The building they had come to assault was now their only hope of survival, but reaching it meant crossing 30 meters of open ground under direct enemy observation. It was suicide. "Wraith, we can't move. They've got us zeroed from 3 directions." "You can move," Vieira replied with absolute certainty. "You just need to trust me." What happened next would be debated by military historians for decades, analyzed by tactical experts, and ultimately classified at levels so high that even the participants weren't allowed to discuss it publicly. But in those 15 minutes above the mountains of Afghanistan, Captain Vieira, Wraith, Volkov proved that sometimes the impossible was just another word for unprecedented. The Spectre descended once again, this time to an altitude so low that the aircraft was practically skimming the mountain peaks. At 200 feet above the ground, flying a damaged aircraft on manual controls in some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth, Vieira began a maneuver that pushed both machine and pilot beyond their design limits. She flew the gunship directly between the enemy positions and the trapped SEALs, using the aircraft itself as a shield while simultaneously engaging targets with every weapon system that still functioned. The 25 cannon raked enemy positions on the eastern ridgeline, while the 40 Bofors engaged targets to the north. The few remaining 105 rounds were used to create smoke screens that obscured the SEALs' movement. For 90 seconds, the Spectre became a flying fortress, absorbing enemy fire that would have killed the Americans while delivering precision strikes that shattered the carefully planned ambush. Machine gun bullets sparked off the aircraft's armor while RPGs exploded harmlessly against its reinforced belly. In those 90 seconds, 12 wounded and exhausted SEALs crossed 30 meters of deadly ground and reached the compound that had been their original target. They kicked down doors, cleared rooms with their remaining ammunition, and secured a defensive position that could actually be held. But the cost was enormous. The Spectre took hundreds of hits during the low-altitude pass, and Chen's damage reports painted a picture of an aircraft that should have fallen from the sky. "We're losing hydraulic fluid fast, Captain. Engine 2 is running rough, and I think they hit our primary flight controls." Vera fought to keep the aircraft airborne, her hands cramping from the effort of controlling a machine that no longer wanted to fly. "How long can we stay up?" "Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less." 5 minutes to end a 6-hour siege. 5 minutes to ensure that 12 men made it home to their families. 5 minutes to complete a mission that had already cost more than anyone should have to pay. Vera looked down at the compound where the SEALs had taken shelter. Through her damaged sensors, she could see enemy fighters regrouping for one final assault on the building. Without air support, the Americans would be overrun in minutes. That's when she made the decision that would define her legacy and cost her everything she had worked for. The final assault began at 12:03 hours, exactly 6 hours and 16 minutes after the first shot had shattered the morning silence. Enemy fighters emerged from concealment all around the compound, moving with the desperate courage of men who knew this was their last chance to complete their mission. Inside the compound, the SEALs had found a building that was part fortress, part laboratory, and part shrine to death. The rooms were filled with bomb-making materials, photographs of successful attacks, and intelligence documents that would keep analysts busy for months. But right now, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the tactical situation. 12 exhausted men with almost no ammunition, facing 50 enemy fighters who were closing in from all sides. "They're at the walls," Williams reported, his voice steady despite the impossible odds. "North, east, and south. Estimate 2 minutes before they breach." Kowalski looked around the room at his men, soldiers who had followed him through hell and were prepared to die rather than surrender. Rodriguez was unconscious, probably dying. Brooks could barely stand. Peterson was losing blood from wounds he'd been hiding for hours. But every man who could still hold a weapon was ready to make their last stand count. "It's been an honor serving with you men," he said simply. Above them, Vera was making her own final preparations. The Spectre was dying around her, systems failing one by one as battle damage finally overcame the aircraft's legendary resilience. Engine 2 was smoking badly, hydraulic pressure was nearly zero, and the flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive. "Captain, we have to leave now," Chen urged. "The aircraft won't stay airborne much longer." Vera looked down at her targeting display one more time. The enemy fighters were clearly visible, climbing the compound walls, preparing to overwhelm the Americans inside. In 30 seconds, maybe less, they would break through and the siege would be over. She thought about her father, who had died believing his daughter was a failure. She thought about the instructors who had said women didn't belong in combat aviation. She thought about all the times she had been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed as someone who could never measure up to the standards required of a warrior. Then she thought about 12 American soldiers who were about to die, unless someone did the impossible. "Radar eject, that's an order." Chen stared at his pilot in shock. "Captain, what are you doing?" "I said eject now." The weapons systems officer hesitated for a split second, then reached for his ejection handles. "It's been an honor flying with you, Captain." "The honor was mine." Chen's ejection seat fired, blasting him clear of the dying aircraft. His parachute deployed automatically, carrying him away from the battle that was about to reach its climax. Alone in her cockpit, Vieira armed the Spectre's remaining weapons and pushed the aircraft into a dive that would end only when her mission was complete or her aircraft was destroyed. At 500 feet per second, she dove toward the compound where 12 Americans were making their last stand. What she did in those final seconds would be classified for 20 years, declassified only when the last of the participants had either died or sworn to take the secret to their graves. But the enemy fighters saw it coming, and their final radio transmissions, intercepted by NSA listening posts thousands of miles away, told the story in their own words. "The ghost comes. The American ghost comes from the sky. Dear God, save us. The silent sniper comes." The Spectre hit the compound at exactly 12:04 hours, 36 minutes after sunrise, 6 hours and 17 minutes after the siege began. The explosion could be seen for 50 miles, and the shock wave cracked windows in villages that had never heard of America or Afghanistan or the war that brought death from the skis. When the smoke cleared, the compound was gone. So were the 50 enemy fighters who had spent the night trying to kill 12 American soldiers. The SEALs, protected by the building's basement levels, survived with injuries that would heal. The siege was over. Captain Vieira,